The officer leaned casually against the hood of his patrol car, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as the vehicle approached. He had been on the job long enough to recognize certain patterns, or at least that's what he believed. The car was sleek but unassuming, the kind of vehicle driven by someone who valued reliability over attention. As it slowed to a stop, his body language shifted into the familiar rhythm of authority, chest slightly out, chin tilted just high enough to signal control. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, making sure the driver could see the badge glinting in the sunlight. There was nothing rushed about him. Every movement was calculated to convey that this was his territory, his moment to set the tone. He approached the driver's side window, hand resting lightly on his utility belt. His eyes swept the interior with practiced ease, though his expression made it clear he had already formed an opinion. The driver, an older black man with a composed demeanor, looked back at him calmly, but the cop's smirk lingered, hinting at an assumption that the encounter would go a certain way. The officer's voice carried that particular tone, polite on the surface, but with an undercurrent that suggested superiority. He asked for the man's license and registration, leaning down slightly as if inspecting the driver, not just the documents. There was no hostility in his words, but a subtle condescension threaded through them, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be insulting. He glanced at the license, his eyebrows raising briefly, though he didn't comment. His gaze returned to the driver's face, lingering for a moment as if trying to read him, but his smirk didn't fade. The small talk he initiated wasn't meant to be friendly, it was a way to maintain control, to set the stage where he was the one asking the questions and the other man was expected to answer. The driver's responses were measured and courteous, but the officer seemed to hear only what he wanted to hear. He shifted his weight, leaning one hand on the roof of the car, looking around casually as though there was no urgency, no reason to hurry. Every gesture, every pause, was steeped in quiet confidence, the kind that can easily tip into arrogance. He wasn't overtly aggressive, but the air around him carried that unspoken message, I'm in charge here. The driver's calm composure didn't rattle him, if anything, it seemed to amuse him. He assumed it was the kind of politeness that came from someone who didn't want trouble, someone used to deferring to authority. As the minutes ticked by, the officer's casual demeanor never wavered. He adjusted his sunglasses, glanced back at his patrol car, and took his time looking over the registration as though he were doing the driver a favor by not rushing. His tone, when he spoke again, was measured, but carried the same subtle edge, the implication that he was allowing this interaction to proceed on his terms. The slight upturn at the corner of his mouth remained, almost as if he were waiting for the driver to make a mistake, to give him a reason to flex his authority just a little more. The surrounding street was quiet, the occasional car passing by without slowing. In that stillness, the dynamic between the two men was clear, one in the position of perceived power, the other subjected to it. The officer's stance was open but dominating, feet planted firmly, shoulders relaxed, projecting the kind of confidence that comes from believing the situation is entirely under control. Even as he handed back the documents momentarily to double-check something on his notepad, there was no sense of urgency in his movements. He maintained eye contact just long enough to make the driver aware of it, then glanced away, as though deciding when and how this interaction would end. There was no question in his mind that he was the one steering it. The air carried a subtle weight, a mix of routine enforcement and the quiet arrogance of someone who believed they understood exactly who they were dealing with. The officer, without saying it outright, made it clear that this was his stage, and for now, the man in the driver's seat was just part of the performance he thought he had seen 100 times before. It began almost imperceptibly, like the faintest ripple in still water. The man in the driver's seat didn't boast, didn't correct, didn't confront, but there were small traces in his demeanor that didn't quite align with the assumptions being made about him. His posture was the first clue. It wasn't the posture of someone nervous or intimidated, it was upright yet relaxed, the kind of composure that suggested long years of discipline. His hands rested on the steering wheel in a way that was precise but unforced, fingers steady, not fidgeting, not clenched. The officer's eyes scanned him again, catching the faint glint of a watch on his wrist. It wasn't flashy, not the kind that screams wealth, but the kind that whispers history. The leather was worn yet well kept, the face of the watch clean, its design simple but expensive in a way only someone with a practiced eye could spot. The driver didn't glance at it, but its presence was a subtle signal, a small piece in a puzzle that didn't yet make sense. When the officer asked routine questions, the man's responses carried a calm precision. He didn't ramble or stutter, didn't try to justify or explain beyond what was necessary. His tone was measured, the kind of voice that could hold a room without raising in volume. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet authority that seemed out of place in a roadside stop. It wasn't arrogance, but something more rooted, the kind of self-possession that comes from years of being listened to. The way he addressed the officer was another hint. He used respectful terms, but they weren't the nervous pleasantries of someone trying to appease. They were matter of fact, almost professional, as if this exchange was just another item on a long list of interactions he'd handled before. His gaze was steady but not challenging, his eyes taking in the officer's words without shrinking from them. The officer noticed, though perhaps not consciously, that there was no sign of fear in the man's expression. There was patience, yes, and perhaps a trace of curiosity, but not the guarded caution he expected. It was as though the man had been in situations far more intense than this one, and this moment barely registered on that scale. The silence between their exchanges wasn't awkward, the driver seemed perfectly at ease letting the air stretch out, unbothered by the lack of small talk. A faint mark on the man's collar caught the officer's peripheral vision, a tiny, embroidered insignia, partially hidden beneath the edge of his jacket. It was subtle enough that most wouldn't notice, but it carried an air of significance. The thread was gold, the design minimal, yet it carried the kind of weight that symbols often do for those who recognize them. The officer's eyes lingered for a second too long, but he quickly looked away, dismissing it as an old logo from some club or organization. His wallet, when he handed it over, was similarly understated. Smooth, well-used leather, free of the bulk and clutter that most carried. Inside, his license was immaculate, the plastic clear, the information perfectly in order. The registration papers were crisp, as though they'd been handled with care, filed neatly and purposefully. There was an efficiency in the way he produced them, no fumbling, no searching, as though he had done it hundreds of times in other contexts. There was also something in his eyes when the officer spoke. They didn't dart around or focus solely on the paperwork, they met his gaze directly when necessary and drifted only to observe the surroundings. It was a controlled awareness, like someone trained to notice exits, angles, movements. Not paranoia, just a habit formed by experience. The conversation, though brief, revealed hints of education and travel. A passing comment about the weather contained a reference to a distant location, mentioned casually but specifically, as though he had spent significant time there. The officer didn't linger on it, but it added another thread to the quiet pattern forming beneath the surface. Even the man's breathing was steady, almost meditative. No shallow breaths, no quickened pace. It was the breathing of someone who understood control, of voice, of body, of presence. When he adjusted his seat slightly, the movement was smooth, deliberate, lacking any of the restless shifting common in tense situations. There were moments when the officer felt a strange flicker of uncertainty, though he couldn't have explained why. Something about the man's quiet confidence unsettled the easy narrative he had constructed when he first approached the car. It was as though he was standing in front of a closed door, hearing faint sounds from the other side, knowing there was more there but unable to see it yet. Every tiny detail, the watch, the insignia, the precise way he spoke, the subtle discipline in his movements, hinted at a life far removed from the assumptions shaping this encounter. The signs were there for anyone who cared to look closely, but the officer, still confident in his own read of the situation, treated them as curiosities rather than warnings of a far more complex reality. The tension in the air began to take on a more tangible weight, though nothing overt had yet been said. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from raised voices or sharp gestures, it was quieter, creeping in around the edges, threading itself into the pauses between words. The officer still maintained his casual stance, but there was a subtle shift in the way his eyes tracked the man in the driver's seat. The smirk had faded just slightly, replaced by something more neutral, though it was clear he was trying to maintain control of the interaction. A few passers-by on the sidewalk slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a patrol car idling with its lights quietly flashing. One or two glanced toward the scene for a moment longer than polite observation would allow, but the officer didn't acknowledge them. His focus stayed locked on the driver, his voice still measured but losing some of its earlier ease. The man in the driver's seat remained composed, his tone unchanged, which only seemed to deepen the strange imbalance building between them. It was in the small moments that the public embarrassment began to take shape. The driver's responses, while perfectly respectful, carried an undercurrent of calm self-assurance that made the officer's earlier condescension seem more obvious to anyone watching. The officer had set the stage expecting to be the unquestioned authority, but the man across from him was not playing into that role. This quiet refusal to be diminished didn't come through in defiance or argument, it came through in the simple act of not yielding an ounce of dignity. As the minutes passed, the officer's attempts to steer the conversation began to falter. Questions that were meant to assert dominance fell flat, answered with such precise clarity that they left no room for further probing. The driver never raised his voice, never matched the officer's body language, yet somehow the control of the moment began to feel less certain. It was a subtle reversal, and one that could easily go unnoticed if you weren't paying attention, but the officer felt it. Every time the driver spoke, a few more seconds of silence followed, as though the officer needed to recalibrate before responding. The crowd on the sidewalk was now a little larger, a pair of teenagers leaning against a bike rack, a man walking his dog who had stopped to tie a shoelace and lingered just a bit too long. None of them said a word, but their presence formed a silent audience. And with an audience comes an unspoken performance, one that the officer had intended to control but now found himself struggling to manage. The driver's stillness became a kind of quiet spotlight. Even without raising his voice or changing his tone, he seemed to command more attention than the uniform standing outside his window. Each measured word he spoke carried a weight that drew the eye, making the officer's earlier confidence look thinner by comparison. What had started as a routine interaction now carried the awkwardness of a stage moment gone wrong, where the lead actor realizes the audience's attention has shifted elsewhere. The officer adjusted his stance, shifting his weight from one leg to the other, glancing briefly at the gathering bystanders before returning his gaze to the driver. His jaw tightened, though only slightly, as he tried to maintain an appearance of ease. Still, the public nature of the moment added a pressure he hadn't anticipated. Every expression, every movement now had witnesses, and the dynamic between the two men was no longer invisible. Even the rhythm of their conversation added to the mounting tension. The officer's pauses grew a fraction longer, as though he was considering his words more carefully, while the driver's responses remained steady, unhurried, and unwavering. The subtle inversion of control was playing out in real time, and though it hadn't tipped fully, the shift was undeniable. When the officer glanced down at the license again, the driver's eyes remained fixed on him, not challenging, not demanding, but unblinking and calm, as if waiting for something inevitable to happen. It was the kind of composure that draws attention, and the bystanders could feel it too. A couple whispered to each other in low tones, the kind of murmurs that signal something unusual is unfolding. The officer cleared his throat before speaking again, his voice still controlled but carrying the faintest trace of strain. The words he chose were careful, but the driver's expression remained unchanged, as though nothing said so far had unsettled him in the slightest. That imbalance, the uniform projecting authority while the seated man quietly radiated a different kind of power, was becoming increasingly visible to those watching. It was no longer just a roadside stop. It was a moment slowly shifting under the weight of perception, where the authority in the room was no longer as clear-cut as it had been when the officer first approached the car. It happened without fanfare, without the kind of dramatic flourish one might expect in a scene where everything changes. The shift began with a single, deliberate motion, the driver reaching calmly into his jacket, retrieving a small leather case that was slimmer and more structured than a wallet. Its edges were clean, the material worn just enough to suggest it had been carried for years with care. He placed it on the dashboard with quiet precision, opening it so that the contents faced the officer. Inside, gleaming under the afternoon light, was an identification card unlike anything the officer had anticipated. The lettering was crisp, embossed with an insignia that immediately drew the eye. Above it, in sharp, clear font, was a name the officer recognized instantly, though it took a beat for his mind to fully process where he had heard it before. Below that name, the title, United States Army, General, 4-star rank. The insignia wasn't decorative, it carried the weight of decades of service, of responsibility few could imagine. 4 silver stars shone against the deep background, arranged in a line that spoke of a career built on discipline, sacrifice, and exceptional command. The image on the card matched the man sitting in the driver's seat exactly, though in the photograph he wore a formal dress uniform, the kind adorned with ribbons and commendations that told their own story to anyone who understood their meaning. For a moment, the space between them felt altered, as though the very air had shifted. The officer's gaze lingered on the card, tracing the lines of the rank insignia, noting the official seals and security features that marked it as genuine. His earlier assumptions collided sharply with this new reality, each thought tripping over the next as he tried to reconcile the composed man before him with the immense authority and respect commanded by the title displayed. The driver hadn't changed his expression. His calm was the same as it had been throughout the interaction, though now it seemed to carry a deeper resonance. There was no smugness, no satisfaction in revealing the truth. It was simply presented, as one might present proof of identity at an airport or secure checkpoint. The gesture was deliberate but unprovocative, the kind of reveal that didn't need theatrics because the truth spoke loudly enough on its own. The bystanders who had been quietly observing were too far to see the details, but they caught the subtle shift in the officer's posture. Shoulders that had been loose in casual authority straightened in something closer to attention. His hand, which had been resting lightly on his belt, now hung at his side in a more neutral position. His eyes flicked from the ID to the man's face, back again, and then once more to the insignia, as though verifying it from every angle. A flicker of recognition moved through his features, not just of the name, but of the weight that name carried. The title of general was not one handed out lightly. It represented a level of trust and responsibility granted to only a handful of people in an entire generation. It meant oversight of thousands of soldiers, strategic decisions that could shape the course of national events, and a career that had passed through the most demanding tests of leadership imaginable. The officer, who had assumed this was just another roadside interaction, now found himself standing before someone whose authority and service eclipsed his own in ways that weren't comparable. The difference wasn't about uniform or badge, it was about the scope of influence, the years of proven leadership, and the quiet gravity of someone who had held lives in their hands on a scale far beyond city streets. Even without raising his voice, the driver's presence seemed to expand in that moment. The ID case remained open on the dashboard, its details clear and undeniable. The small golden eagle emblem, the Department of the Army seal, the precision of the document's layout, all spoke of a level of authenticity that left no room for doubt. The officer's earlier tone of casual authority no longer fit the reality before him. The man in the driver's seat had not only served his country but had done so at the highest echelon, a position that demanded respect from even the most senior officials. The reveal had taken only seconds, but it altered the unspoken hierarchy of the interaction completely, placing the officer in the unexpected position of confronting someone whose achievements dwarfed his own. The silence following the reveal was not awkward, but it was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. The bystanders, still unaware of the specifics, could sense that something significant had just happened. The way the officer now stood, the way his eyes moved with a different kind of focus, signaled a change that didn't need to be announced aloud. The driver waited, his hands resting loosely in his lap, the ID still visible. He made no move to push the moment forward, allowing the officer the space to take in what had just been placed before him. The quiet between them was no longer about tension or challenge, it was the kind of pause that comes when the truth arrives so clearly that nothing more needs to be said immediately. The transformation in the officer's demeanor was subtle at first, almost as if he were trying to mask the impact of what he had just learned. His body language, which had once been loose and casual, shifted into something more formal without him seeming to realize it. His stance became straighter, his feet set more firmly but without the previous air of dominance. The tilt of his chin lowered slightly, and the smirk that had clung to his face earlier was gone entirely. He glanced at the identification again, as if making absolutely certain of its authenticity, but his eyes didn't linger the same way they had before. Now they carried something closer to respect, even a hint of deference. His voice, when he finally spoke, was softer, more measured, and lacked the faint edge it had carried earlier. There was no rush in his tone, but there was an unmistakable shift, a quiet acknowledgement that the dynamic had changed. The bystanders who had been watching closely noticed it too. The casual, almost dismissive authority that had defined the start of the encounter was replaced by an attentiveness that felt deliberate. The officer now seemed more aware of his surroundings, as though he wanted to ensure the moment unfolded without unnecessary escalation or spectacle. His hand, which had hovered near his utility belt before, now rested loosely at his side, his gestures smaller, more controlled. He began to choose his words more carefully, the sharpness replaced with something that felt almost diplomatic. Every question was now phrased in a way that offered space for a full response, rather than being framed as a challenge. It was as though he had realized that he wasn't simply speaking to another driver, he was speaking to someone who had stood in rooms with generals, diplomats, and heads of state, someone who had navigated situations far more complex than a roadside stop. The driver, for his part, remained exactly as he had been from the beginning, calm, composed, and steady. But now, that composure took on a new dimension in the officer's eyes. It was no longer mistaken for passivity or compliance, it was recognized for what it was, the bearing of a leader, someone accustomed to holding his ground without the need to raise his voice. The officer seemed to sense that every second of this interaction was being weighed and measured, not out of suspicion, but because the man in front of him operated at a level of precision where every detail mattered. When the officer handed back the ID, his fingers moved with care, almost as if returning a ceremonial object rather than a piece of plastic. The exchange, once purely procedural, now carried an unspoken formality. The ID wasn't just proof of identity, it was a symbol of decades of service, of battles fought both in the open and behind the scenes, of decisions that had shaped the lives of countless people. The tone of the conversation shifted again as the officer began to frame his words in a way that acknowledged the other man's status without saying it outright. He asked fewer questions and made more statements that invited agreement rather than demanded compliance. It was subtle, but it was the language of someone who recognized they were speaking to an equal, or, perhaps more truthfully, to a superior. There was a noticeable change in his expression as well. The guarded confidence that had defined the first moments of the encounter had been replaced by something more thoughtful. His eyes no longer scanned the driver as though assessing for potential infractions, instead, they held steady, conveying a level of focus that suggested he was aware of the significance of this meeting. Even his movements had slowed. Where earlier he had leaned on the car roof casually, now he stood upright, maintaining a respectful distance from the window. The moment felt less like an officer controlling an interaction and more like one person engaging another with mutual recognition. The uniform still carried authority, but it was now tempered by an understanding that authority was not absolute in every situation, that there were hierarchies beyond the one stitched onto his shoulder patch. The onlookers, unable to hear every word, could still read the change in atmosphere. The tension that had been simmering earlier was gone, replaced by a quieter, more deliberate energy. The officer seemed almost aware that this was not a moment to assert dominance, but rather one to navigate with care. There was no overt display of submission, but every aspect of his behavior, from the measured cadence of his voice to the respectful set of his posture, spoke to an acknowledgement of the other man's standing. The conversation no longer felt like a routine stop at all. It had taken on an air of careful diplomacy, the kind of exchange where both parties understood that what was left unsaid was just as important as what was spoken aloud. The officer's focus was no longer on moving the interaction along quickly, but on ensuring it unfolded in a way that reflected the gravity of what had just been revealed. Long after the initial surprise had settled, the unspoken moral of the encounter began to crystallize in the air between them. It wasn't something either man articulated outright, but it was there, woven into the shift in tone, posture, and presence. The moment had moved far beyond the exchange of documents or the clarification of identity. It had become a quiet, living example of why respect cannot be contingent on assumptions, and why humility often arrives too late for those who underestimate the people in front of them. The officer stood differently now, his stance carrying none of the casual swagger from the beginning. What had started as a one-sided performance of authority had transformed into something closer to parity, though, truthfully, the balance was tilted in the other man's favor. The driver hadn't raised his voice, hadn't tried to assert his importance, and yet his presence had spoken volumes. His patience and composure throughout the encounter had allowed the truth to reveal itself naturally, without the need for confrontation. The onlookers, still lingering at a respectful distance, couldn't hear the words being exchanged, but they could see the difference. What they had initially read as a standard roadside stop now carried an undercurrent they could sense even without details. The officer's body language no longer signaled control of the situation in the way it once had. Instead, it reflected a recognition, one that comes when you realize the person you've been addressing holds a depth of experience and accomplishment you hadn't imagined. There was an unintentional lesson unfolding for anyone who happened to be watching closely. It was a reminder of how easy it is to reduce a person to the surface details you see in the first few seconds, and how quickly that reduction can be shattered by a single truth. The moment the officer saw the insignia and the rank, every casual assumption he had made was overturned. It was as if he had been speaking to one version of the man in front of him, only to realize there had been an entirely different reality behind the calm face all along. The driver didn't use the revelation as a weapon. There was no pointed speech about respect, no overt demand for an apology. His approach itself was the message, that true authority doesn't need to announce itself to be felt, and that the people most worthy of respect are often the ones who don't demand it. The quiet dignity he maintained was, in its own way, a form of instruction, showing the officer what it means to carry power without arrogance. The officer, for his part, seemed to understand this without needing it spelled out. The earlier edge in his voice had disappeared entirely, replaced by a steadiness that bordered on careful deference. He didn't stumble over his words or fumble for excuses, but there was a notable shift in how he spoke, as though each sentence was weighed for tone before it left his mouth. It was the kind of change that happens when you realize you've been standing in the wrong frame of reference the whole time. Every small movement in the interaction now carried a different weight. The simple act of returning the ID card was done with both hands, not as a conscious show of respect, but as a natural response to the significance of what it represented. The officer's eyes no longer scanned the driver for signs of nervousness or guilt, instead, they lingered just long enough to acknowledge the person in front of him fully. The bystanders gradually began to drift away, sensing that whatever they had been hoping to witness as drama had quietly resolved into something more subdued. Still, a few lingered, watching as the two men continued their exchange. They could tell that the atmosphere was no longer about enforcement or compliance, it was about acknowledgement. In the quiet that followed each exchange of words, the moral of the situation seemed to echo without sound: authority without humility can be fragile, and assumptions are a weak foundation for judgment. The officer might have started this interaction believing he knew exactly who he was dealing with, but the truth had shown him otherwise. What remained in the air now was not tension but something closer to reflection. The officer stood a little straighter, not from a need to appear imposing, but from an awareness of the respect due to the man before him. The driver sat with the same unshakable composure he'd had all along, his calm now understood for what it truly was, the quiet assurance of someone who had nothing to prove.